Welcome to the SBTI's Training for Financial Institutions. This is module number 6, Scope 3 Finance Emissions, Calculation Deep Dive, Case Studies. In this module, we will be discussing details around how to calculate Scope 3 baselines and targets using the available methodologies. At this point, you should be familiar with Scope 3 finance emissions. After completing this module, you will be able to apply the 3 methods to develop baselines and set targets, source the relevant data required to set targets, and decide on the trade-offs between the different methods. Let's get started. As a reminder, emissions are classified into direct, Scope 1, and indirect, Scope 2 and 3 emissions. Scope 3 can be further divided into those originating from companies' operations, categories 1 through 14, and those originating from finance emissions, category 15. In modules 4 through 7, we explore how to set targets for each of these categories of emissions. Because Scope 3 finance emissions are so much larger for financial institutions, we spend more time on how to calculate Scope 3 finance emissions. This module provides a deep dive on calculating baselines and targets for Scope 3 finance emissions. Before we jump into the slide content, I want to orient you to the tickers that you see on the top left and top right of the slides. We include these on all slides throughout modules 4, 5, 6, and 7, so you know what stage of the process you're in on the left side and what scope of emissions this applies to on the right side. Moving on to the page. Financial institutions and their portfolio companies and customers must often estimate total emissions using several inputs. To begin, companies track physical or business units, such as energy consumption by kilowatt hour, or tons of steel produced, or at a minimum, revenue or other financial factors. Then, many governmental bodies or non-governmental organizations, NGOs, publish emissions factors for industries or regions, such as emissions per kilowatt hour or per ton of steel. Aggregating these data sources together allows for financial institutions and their portfolio companies and clients to estimate their total emissions. As mentioned, these data sources will come from a variety of places. Starting on the left-hand side for actual emissions or business units, this data can sometimes be requested from portfolio companies or for clients. Oftentimes, it will be publicly available across a variety of voluntary disclosure forums, such as CDP or through ratings agencies like the S&P or MSCI, an ESG-focused ratings agency. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has also partnered with Qantas and has a Scope 3 estimating tool that is available and open source for financial institutions and their portfolio companies or clients. Similarly, there may be sector-specific labels as well, such as Energy Star in the US or building classification systems that are used in the Netherlands. Once business-level units have been accessed, financial institutions can then look to emissions factors. Emissions factors come in 2 flavors, in physical activity emissions factors or monetary or economic activity factors. Physical activity factors, such as carbon dioxide equivalents per megawatt hour or kilowatt hour, are often available from global data sets, such as from IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. Governments may have these factors as well, such as the UK's Department of Environmental, Food and Rural Affairs. Lastly, if a financial institution chooses to use PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, PCAF has databases available for physical activity emissions for select activities for its members. For economic activities factors, they are available from official statistical data, or EEIO tables, often published by higher education institutions. For example, the EXIO base is a consortium made up of several Norwegian universities and EU think tanks. WIOD is the World Input-Output Database, is a project published by the Netherlands University of Groningen, its Growth and Development Center. And similarly, PCAF also has these economic factors that are available for their participating financial institutions. Now that we have a baseline understanding of what types of data will be needed to be accessed, we can go into more detail on the intricacies required in calculating baselines and targets of Scope 3 finance emissions. As a reminder, these are the 3 methods that are allowable for calculating the baseline for Scope 3 finance emissions. More detail on these methods is available in the previous module, Module 5. These three methods, again, are the sectoral decarbonization approach, the portfolio coverage approach, and the temperature rating approach. We will go through each approach in detail with a one-page summary and a two-page case study for each approach. Let's begin with the sectoral decarbonization approach. The sectoral decarbonization approach is recommended for any sectors that have specific SBTI sectoral guidance. And these include the commercial and residential real estate, electricity generation, and several other high-emitting industries, such as cement or other industrials. SBTI has a full listing of industries with specific sectoral guidance, and this is available in Table 5-1 of the guidance document. SBTI aims to have specific scenarios and guidance for 11 sectors available by the end of 2022. Putting this into practice, an example SDA target from Eurazeo, an asset manager, looks like decreasing greenhouse gas emissions from their real estate investment portfolio by 60% per square meter. Now let's discuss the benefits and key considerations of this approach. Sectoral decarbonization approaches are well regarded and prominent, given the wide and growing adoption of SBTs in the real economy. In addition, the standardization of the core metric, such as emissions per ton of product, make it easier to compare within a sector. Additionally, a key benefit for financial institutions is that SDAs can simplify decision-making. A financial institution can apply it for all applicable industries within the specific sector. Some challenges include needing more data than other approaches, which have easier simplification methods, and that there's still several sectors that do not have sector-specific guidance. Sector-specific guidance is being prioritized for high-emitting sectors only, and SBTI continues to publish new guidance and include new industries. In summary, the sectoral decarbonization approach is for companies who want both credibility and flexibility. It takes into account the differing situations in each sector. We'll now move into a two-page case study of a financial institution who set their targets using a sectoral decarbonization approach. We'll talk through De Volksbank's baseline and target setting for their sectoral decarbonization approach target. For those who may not be familiar, De Volksbank is the number 4 retail bank in the Netherlands, and included in their portfolio are 47.8 billion euros of mortgages as of December 2019. As a reminder, mortgages are still optional for financial institutions, but sector-specific guidance is available. To sum up their approach for the sectoral decarbonization approach, De Volksbank calculated their mortgage footprint and associated emissions, factored in their share of emissions, given that each mortgage has different remaining balances, and finally defined their ambition and emissions targets. Let's go into each of these in a bit more detail. De Volksbank's first calculated total square meterage of portfolios across their portfolio, total square meterage of mortgages across their portfolios in their base year. Then they assigned an energy grade for each mortgage using data that was available from the Dutch government. Through these, they were able to quantify the emissions of their portfolios. However, as many of you are probably thinking, this is actually quite challenging, which is why we will discuss it in more detail on the next page. Next, De Volksbank's calculated their share of emissions on each mortgage given the percent of balance that was outstanding. As a reminder, financial institutions are only responsible for the emissions that they are financing. Lastly, they used SBTI's target setting tool to define their pathway based on the current emissions, planned growth, and square meterage. Let's discuss the challenges and approach that De Volksbank took with finding and assigning energy ratings in order to estimate emissions. They were able to do this in 3 steps, noting the energy ratings and emissions, assigning energy grades, and then estimating total emissions. The Dutch government provides energy labels ranging from A, the most efficient homes, to G, the least efficient homes. They also provided estimated annual emissions across these energy grades. Emissions from homes come from 2 main sources, gas and electricity. One thing that De Volksbank noticed was that the majority of emissions for all homes came from gas, and the worse the energy rating, the higher proportion of emissions from gas, which is higher polluting. Next, De Volksbank had to assign these energy ratings across their portfolio. On these bar charts, you will see that DeVolk's banks had a range of data availability. The orange sections represent definitive, high-quality ratings, newer homes who had official government ratings, for example. The dark gray bars show indicative data, homes where DeVolk's bank could likely estimate a home energy rating given its age, neighborhood, and other factors such as building materials. Lastly, the light gray shows that some data across all energy ratings were extrapolated estimates. DeVolk's bank was able to set their target even though only about 20% of their data was definitive. And they also noted that, unsurprisingly, data was available more so for lower emitting A-label homes. After assigning each mortgage an energy label, DeVolk's bank was able to estimate emissions, and they were able to aggregate their mortgages, shown on the left-hand side bar, and also the associated emissions, shown on the right-hand side bar, since the government had provided those estimated emissions by energy label. As DeVolk's banks increases its data quality, it can slowly replace the estimated emissions with actuals from the mortgage that they provide. One key takeaway that the DeVolk's bank team noticed was that their initial hypothesis on an engagement strategy was proved wrong. They noticed that if they were to focus on shifting their portfolio to consist of entirely of A energy label homes, the most efficient homes, they would still not meet their decarbonization targets. And this is because so many emissions are coming from gas in these homes. As such, DeVolk's banks plans to work with the current and future homeowners to increase the amount and pace of electrification, which will reduce emissions more quickly than just providing lending to Category A energy grade homes. Let's move on to discuss the portfolio coverage approach. Again, we'll discuss an overview page and provide another detailed 2-page case study. The portfolio coverage approach centers engagement and allows financial institutions to progress with limited data. This is because it's defined as what percent of a financial institution's portfolio has set their own science-based targets. Targets set out a linear path from the base year to 2040, where it is expected that financial institutions reach 100% coverage of their portfolio. The method uses a linear calculation based on the number of years from the base year to 2040. And this allows time for portfolio companies themselves to decarbonize to reach net zero by 2050. So, for example, a company with 20% coverage from a base year of 2020 would need to hit 100% coverage by 2040 in 20 years. This would mean a 4% increase year over year, which is 80% divided by those 20 years. For an example, Sycamore Asset Management's target committed to meeting 56% coverage by 2030. Now let's discuss the benefits and key considerations for using this approach. Starting with benefits, the portfolio coverage is the most intuitive and easily communicated approach, especially when considering messaging to the public. Additionally, it can be done without knowing emissions data, since companies can choose to use a monetary denominator when calculating their coverage. We'll discuss the coverage options in more detail in our case study. For considerations, SBTI recognizes that many financial institutions have expansive portfolios covering hundreds or thousands of companies. Engaging with these companies to set SBTs themselves can be resource intensive, especially if the financial institutions are not able to allocate resources to it. Hearing from a prominent financial institution who applied this method, La Banque Postal's asset management arm found that portfolio coverage analysis was the friendliest method for both internal and public disclosure purposes among the three methods. Now let's talk about how they did that. Again, we'll be reviewing a case study of La Banque Postal's asset management subsidiary, which is the 5th largest asset manager in France, with over 235 billion euros under management as of December 2019. They selected the portfolio coverage approach, and what that meant was that they identified the number of SBTs in their portfolio. They then chose a weighting method to define how they were counting coverage. And lastly, they calculated their commitment timeline, knowing that they had to reach 100% coverage by 2040. When looking at the SBTs within their portfolio, La Banque Postal's asset management division was intentional to include what stage of the target setting process their portfolio companies were in. They then chose a weighting method. Financial institutions can choose from several of these, including by a financial institution's assets under management, by estimated emissions, or by companies' market capitalization or enterprise value, depending on if a company is listed or private. As you might expect, that's the challenging portion that we'll discuss on the next page. And lastly, Le Bon Postal Asset Management was able to engage with high priority investees to encourage them to commit to setting their own SBTs, again with the goal of 100% coverage by 2040. Le Bon Postal's asset management implemented their portfolio coverage approach by first identifying the commitment status and then applying it across both their equity and their bonds portfolio. In identifying their commitment status, Le Bon Postal Asset Management decided to set 5 categories of investees, one being the most advanced, with a set and approved science-based target, and 5 being the least advanced, where there's not even consideration or information available on decarbonization and climate change. They were able to use SBTI's website to quickly search for companies in their portfolios that had verified SBTs. And they were then able to apply it to their equity portfolio. This bar chart shows Le Bon Postal Asset Management's equity portfolio, and they apply the 5 categories listed from both a financial view, assets under management, and an estimated emissions view with CO2 emissions. Roughly, the proportion of assets invested and emissions look similar across the portfolio. However, when shifting to their bonds portfolio, Le Bon Postal Asset Management realized that the coverage of companies with commitments with set targets were only about 10% of assets under management, 20% of assets under management, and this is groups 1 and group 2 in the dark and light green, and they were closer to 40 or 45% of emissions, nearly double. SBTI recognizes that actual emissions data may not be available across the portfolio. Financial institutions should estimate as needed, and recall that the portfolio coverage approach doesn't require emissions data in order to set a target. However, it's important to remember that assets under management and estimated emissions are not always proportional, just like in the case of Le Bon Postal Asset Management's bonds portfolio. And with that in mind, just like with financial metrics, data can help portfolio managers evaluate and prioritize where to spend their efforts in engaging with portfolio companies or investees. Next, we'll move on to the final approach, which is the temperature rating approach. The temperature rating approach is recommended for non-sectoral decarbonization industries with more data availability. Specifically, there are 2 temperature scores that are required for the temperature rating, and they're based on portfolio companies' greenhouse gas targets and ambitions. Those who lack a publicly stated ambition receive a default score of 3.2 degrees Celsius. And again, this is calculated for scope 1 and 2, and separately for scope 1, 2, and 3 for financial institutions. Similarly to the portfolio coverage approach, there's an annual trajectory which is calculated with the same 2040 goal, which allows portfolio companies in the real economy to meet their climate ambitions. Schroders plc, a British asset management firm, used the temperature rating approach for a collection of their assets and bonds, committing to align their scope 1, 2, and 3 portfolio temperature score by invested value within common stock, preferred stock, corporate bonds, ETFs, and REITs from 3.13 degrees in 2019 to 2.29 degrees in 2030. Let's talk through the benefits and key considerations for this approach. The TRA allows financial institutions to identify the highest emitting portfolio components by sector and geography, since there's a weighting methodology that's embedded within. Additionally, it relies on publicly available commitment data for companies, which can make the data burden significantly lighter for financial institutions. Furthermore, SBTI has an open source tool that allows financial institutions to input the existing public target data for their portfolio companies so that financial institutions can understand what the temperature rating is. For key considerations, because of the complex underlying equations and methodologies for temperature rating, it can be less intuitive to communicate, again, especially when you're thinking about public relations. Schroders selected temperature rating approach as they believe it is the best practice to use the temperature alignment methodology, and as it avoids pulling capital and scrutiny away from areas of financial markets where change is most needed, rather than divesting. Again, this echoes the influence principle that SBTI knows is core to financial institutions' contributions in this space. We'll now move to a case study of a different asset manager, Amundi. Amundi is the largest asset manager in the EU, with over 1.5 trillion assets under management in euros. And they use the temperature rating approach, which require them to gather the available target data for their portfolio, aggregate and use SBTI's open source tool to assign temperature ratings to companies, and chart the path forward by defining their ambition and commitment targets. In order to gather their portfolio target data, they access databases to note ambitions. They also noted which companies lacked targets or GHG data. Again, gathering these targets may be a challenge, so we'll talk about it more on the next slide. Next, they were able to assign default scores to any portfolio companies that didn't have targets and select a method to determine the weighted aggregate portfolio temperature rating, which can also be challenging. So we'll talk more about that on the next page. And lastly, Amundi set their target to achieve a temperature rating of well below 2 degrees Celsius by 2040 for their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Let's detail out how Amundi gathered targets and scores and then aggregated them. Now, Amundi has several portfolios under management, and across their funds, they gathered published climate ambitions, with some funds having much more companies with published ambitions, which is shown in the blue. So for example, Fund A has much more publicly stated ambitions than Fund B. These companies were all scored individually, again, which was done using SBTI's open source temperature rating tool. Any companies that lack a published ambition or a verified target were assigned a default score of 3.2 degrees, regardless of sector. It's important to note 2 points in this process. The first is that Amundi was able to gather the published ambitions quite easily. And then the second, it's okay, as different funds will have different levels of incomplete data. And this is why the default score is available. Now that they had the ambitions, Amundi needed to aggregate the scores. So we'll move to the right-hand side of the page. The temperature rating guide outlines 7 different methods to aggregate and weight scores. Now, there's the weighted average temperature score for those financial institutions who are lacking emissions data. And there are 6 additional methods for those with emissions data, which includes both emissions-based and financial factors. Depending on the financial institution's strategy, they need to select the best fitting method. Those with poor emissions data can select the weighted average temperature score, as it doesn't require any estimated emissions. This, again, just measures weighting based on financial institutions' investments. Those who want to maximize their alignment with PCAF should use the enterprise value and cash emissions temperature score. Again, it's looking at that same EVIC, enterprise value, including cash, weighting the company's, the financial institution's investment, the total size of the company, as well as their emissions, and using that to properly weight the importance of that company's emissions within a financial institution's portfolio. That wraps up our case studies, and I want to ground everyone in the objective of financial institutions' efforts in setting science-based targets. And that is to transform financing and catalyze clients and portfolio companies in their decarbonization efforts. And so when financial institutions set targets, they serve as a signal across sectors, especially since there's a $2 to $5 trillion of annual financing required through 2040 to reach this net zero transformation. Financial institutions recognize that those with targets can take advantage of this opportunity to lead the market during this transformation period, especially through their engagement with real economy companies. And not only that, but this engagement will have compounding returns as companies will continue to transform and push their industries to more climate mitigation actions. Lastly, this engagement leads to improved tracking across portfolios of financial institutions, given that data will grow to be more available, more accessible, and higher quality, in large part due to the engagement that financial institutions will undertake. As a reminder, this transition will occur over time. The bar chart on the right-hand side shows an example financial institution who is on the vanguard or the leading edge of the net zero transformation. You'll see that over the years towards 2050, they're achieving more and more green assets in their portfolio, while still minimizing divestitures, given their focus on influence over companies that they are lending to or investing in, and pushing those companies to be greener and greener. Concluding this module, you should leave with a few key takeaways. The sectoral decarbonization approach is preferred for covered sectors. The portfolio coverage approach is based on engagement and requires the least amount of data. The temperature rating approach also anchors on engagement, but is recommended for when financial institutions mature their portfolio's data. And a reminder that data challenges will exist throughout, which we'll talk about extensively in the next module, and that financial institutions must make assumptions until data matures over time. And lastly, and most importantly, financial institutions can use their influence to increase data quality across their portfolio. Thank you for your listening.